Welcome to Between Two Psychs, a podcast where two psychologists and board-approved supervisors deep dive into many of the questions and challenges that provisional psychologists and early career therapists face in everyday practice, during training, throughout the internship, and beyond as they progress into working more independently. Your hosts, Isabelle Tombleson and Claire Trevitt, talk about a range of topics specifically relating to psychologists and therapists who are just starting out.
Hi, Claire.
Hi.
All right, we are going to talk today about intake processes and how we would like to show you how to set things up in the beginning with your clients so that they have a positive therapy experience.
Exactly. Yes, and the reason we thought this would be important, well, actually, this is going to be in conjunction with a series of episodes that we're planning on some clinical therapy tips for you, is we want to differentiate today between the initial intake session and the initial therapy session.
That's right. And the initial intake process involves often talking to our clients when they first contact us, but there are a whole bunch of other things that are involved in that initial process that we're going to cover for you. Yeah. Claire, do you want to run everyone through what we're going to be covering today?
Yes, so the initial intake is really what happens before we see the client. And so it's really about getting some clarity about what the client is looking for and also the service that we are providing, and to get a sense of whether or not that's going to be a good fit before the client then commits to engaging in therapy.
So this theme of clarity, so we'll address that. And there are a couple of other things that we're going to run through today as well. I think we mentioned like making sure that we've got scheduling and accessibility set up appropriately for our consumers. We'll also touch on probably confidentiality and informed consent, which is, I guess, what clarity is about. Can you think of anything else we're going to touch on today that I might have missed?
Yes, I guess it's everything that the client needs to know before they enter the therapy room, so that when they do come in for that initial session, they've got some sense of why they're coming and what the service is going to support them with.
So helping them to have a good understanding of what they're entering into.
Yes, because it can feel very daunting. I think if a client has a sense before they enter the room of what it is that they're coming in for, it can settle things a little for them. It's still going to be nerve-wracking. They're still going to often feel quite anxious about the process. But at least having that information and feeling informed about whether or not it feels like the right direction for them before they even get there.
Beautiful. Okay, let's go back to where we started. Setting things up for a good journey with our clients. And you can speak really well to being on the private practice area of providing therapy. Claire, what's your experience of how you set things up from the beginning, say from that initial contact with a client? What are the things that you like to include in that process?
So I think the first thing is the very first contact that the client has with the service and what that's likely to look like. So it might be that they go onto a website and they get a sense of what information is provided there in terms of the services that you provide, the experience that the clinician has, any questions around fees and those sorts of things can be really helpful to include on the website so that the client really has a sense of, okay, this is going to be a match for me, or I can afford these services and this looks like it could be a good fit. What I like to do is to have an initial conversation with all of my clients. So I do speak to them over the phone, and usually for around 15, 20 minutes. That can vary. And I really do to give the client a sense of the type of therapy that I provide and what that might look like for them, and get a sense of what they're looking for and whether or not that's going to be a good fit. And I do offer them the opportunity to ask questions, and some have a lot of questions and some don't have many questions at all. It tends to be if somebody has experience of therapy, they may come with many more questions. If somebody has not seen a therapist before, they may not know what to ask.
This is like what we would call in my service an introductory phone call.
Yes.
It's a chance for the client to hear your voice and to get to know you a little bit and some of the other practical aspects of, if I'm going to engage in therapy with you, how are we going to make this work? But yeah, that's how I see it. And we are introducing something like that in my practice as well, but from a government community health perspective.
It can be, look, it's the clinician has to show up for the session, the client has to show up for the session. Usually there's a fee involved. Even if the client's not paying the fee, the service does cost money and the funding comes from somewhere. So we ideally want to make sure that when the client is coming in for that first session, that it's set up well and that then therapy can begin. Other than having that exploration session. Of course, that's going to be part of it anyway, because when you get into the room, it may emerge that it's not the right service, but at least if you've tried to set it up, then there's more of a chance of it working going ahead, and there's less time wasted, less energy wasted, and less money wasted.
I have this thought as well that sometimes when you speak to someone, a therapist, for the first time on the phone, and speaking as someone who's seen a therapist myself, you get a sense for what the person's like as well when you hear their voice. And I'll say to some of my clients, if I'm suggesting that they go and find a private practice therapist to go and see, it's okay to get a sense of who they are and what they're like over the phone. Listen to like the nuances of the voice. And if you're feeling comfortable and safe in that conversation, then that's a really good sign. But at the same time, it's all right to think, oh, I'm not sure if that person sounds like the right sort of person for me, and go try someone else as well. Like those initial contacts, those phone contacts are really valuable in that way too.
I think they are. And also setting up what it's going to look like. So for example, I work in private practice, and some of my days are full. I only see clients in person one day a week, and I have an office for designated times, and I see clients at designated times as well. So I may only have a couple of spaces that I could see that person. And so I really want to make sure that that time spot is going to work for that person, because it's no use them saying, oh, I'll take next Friday off and I'll see how it goes, and then say, oh, have you got after hours appointments, which I don't have? And then, of course, we're stuck and they're going back to see someone else. So I will be really clear, this is the time I have available.
Right.
This is the fee that I charge. Is that going to work for you?
Yeah.
Because and it may be that I have weekly, or it may be that I have a fortnightly space. And if a client works shift work, I'd say I could do telehealth on another day, and make sure that they're happy with that arrangement, and that they don't think they're just going to be able to book in at the time of their choice every week, because that's very unlikely.
And I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask this to you just for the benefit of our listeners. Why is this so important?
It sets up the expectations. I like to see clients on a regular basis at the same time, or each week or fortnightly. And for me, I feel that sets up that consistency.
And what's important about consistency in the work that we do?
It's so important because the work that we do does require an ongoing process. And I think that as therapists, particularly if we work in a relational space, which I do, and that would be with people who have generally maybe experienced some relational difficulties in their life, consistency and reliability are often things that have been missing in the person's life. And so as a therapist, for me, it's very important to provide those things. So the client knows what they're getting. They know what time their session is. They know when it starts. They know when it ends. And when they arrive at my office, I try to be on time and finish sessions on time, so that they know exactly where they stand, and reliable and predictable. And I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to those things are so important for that feeling safe, and for that, forgetting the word of it now, but like for helping people to be co-regulated with us. So important for that feeling of safety and calmness with us. That predictability offers that. And you talk about how you work in that relational space. it's something that I think most of us are doing maybe without even realizing it. Like a lot of us are psychotherapists at heart. That's your foundational training. We are aware of how important that feeling of safety and calmness in the therapeutic relationship is with us. And yeah, that's a very important element. And it's something that we start to set up from the very first time we speak with our clients.
Yes, because when the client knows that those things are in place, then it makes it much, much easier to then begin to explore some of those other challenges that they're experiencing. But when they're sitting in the room thinking, I don't know when my next session's going to be. I have heard some horror stories with practices who have booked in clients in a cancellation spot, for example. So the client's turned up for their very first session. They've been offered a cancellation spot. They connect with the therapist and want another session, but they have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for the next session. And to me, that's not acceptable. Because if a client comes in and wants that session, they'll want that session next week or in the fortnight's time, and they'll want to know that's happening. But to not know, and they're going to come into a session and not even know what they can bring up because they've got to pack it all away at the end and possibly for quite a long time. So setting that up at the beginning, I think, is just a foundation that for me is completely non-negotiable.
Beautiful. And so from that initial phone call, you'll be probably getting some contact details for your client, email addresses, maybe even emergency contacts, setting up that sort of that information in so that you've got that contained and ready for, I guess, the business side of things, but also the risk side of things too. Do you do that in that initial phone call, or do you send out a form separately for all of that?
So I send out forms. I used to do that at the very first session because we used to use pen and paper forms. And so, of course, the client would come in and fill that in person. But now that I can have the capacity to send those out online, what I like to do is get the client's email address in the session, in the intake call, and then I send out my forms and I make sure that they have received those in the phone call so that if they've gone to junk, they can see that they're there so that we're not.
That's a good tip. Yeah.
Yeah, so that we're not sitting there, I'm not sitting there wondering if they've received them and following up. And I say to them, and I say to them in the email as well, if you can fill these out before the first session, we're going to have more time together because we're not going to be spending time on the paperwork. And in that, I cover some basic details. I cover confidentiality and get consent. And I also mention cancellation.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
And we've got a similar process in the government community health service where I work, and it's probably quite similar across most of the community health services in at least New South Wales, where we have an intake separate dedicated intake person. Or if it's not a full-time position taking intake calls, it might be clinicians allocated to that task for that day. And we just have a form that we fill in, and it includes most of the information that you've already outlined there. And something that we're going to try in my service as an improvement project is to include an introductory phone call before the first counselling appointment. So in between that intake worker taking the details and giving an appointment time and that person coming in for the appointment, the counsellor they're assigned to is actually going to call them and just do that introduction. Hi, my name is Isabelle. I'm going to be your counsellor. I'm just calling to introduce myself and say hello. Double check that you're all good with the time that you've been assigned to see me. Do you have any questions? And we're hoping actually that might increase attendance to those first appointments, because we don't know why, but there is this phenomenon in particular in drug and alcohol where we have consumers there's at least a 40% portion of consumers on average that aren't coming to the first appointment. So we're trying to work out why that is and see if we can help people navigate that or overcome that.
Yeah, so spending a little bit of time so that they know. I think hearing your voice is also really important because they just have a sense of who you are. And like you said, they'll get a sense of whether or not it feels like a connection. And it doesn't have to be a strong connection, but there has to be a sense of this will be the person that will be supporting me through some challenges. And so we want them to feel comfortable. And also, some clients do come with questions. And I say to people, you may or may not have questions, but if you do, And usually actually what I say to people is, would you like me to tell you a little bit about the way that I work? And mostly they'll say, yes, please. And so I'll give them a sense of what the way that I work. It may or may not be different to other psychologists that they've seen or other counsellors or therapists that they've seen. And I want them to say, that sounds like a good approach to me. Or, you know what, I was really looking for somebody who could maybe have a bit more structure, or someone told me that DBT was a really good therapy. And of course, that's not the therapy I'm not trained in. And so I would then say, it sounds like you're looking for something a little bit different. And really, we want the person to make the right decision for them.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Claire. And we would do a similar thing as well. Drug and alcohol service, coming in for drug and alcohol treatment, but then all of the counsellors have their own unique things that they can do that, like, slightly differently as well. So so there are overlaps, and we're using our Claire's and my examples just to demonstrate how different services are going to have different processes for this, but there will be overlaps and really important themes that are covered in this initial process, and for the benefit of the client, but also just from a risk point of view and even from a legal point of view as well, like making sure that our consumers are making an informed decision about engaging in therapy with us. And that's the principle that you're covering there, Claire, when you talk about explaining how you do things and the types of therapies you're trained in. That's a really important part of gaining that informed consent.
Absolutely. The client needs to know what they're coming in for. And the other thing I wanted to add in terms of the intake form, so I do ask some questions. I have their personal details. I don't have a particularly detailed intake form. I think that a lot of that information I'm going to gather on the first session, and I don't want the client to feel like they're going to be repeating their story. And also, I don't want to ask too many personal questions in that initial intake. So I tend to be quite general, but I do try and also be quite inclusive in that process. So one of the questions that I will write, and I think this is very important for psychologists looking at the new competencies that are coming out in terms of being gender affirming. So I always ask what the person's pronouns are. The intake form. So I've got that information up front because that gives that information, because it's important to individuals to feel seen. And I also ask if there's any other information that they think that I should be aware of, or that they would like me to know. And also whether they have maybe any particular supports or needs that are important to them.
I'm even thinking like accessibility as well. If they're coming to see you in person, or even doing telehealth, have you got a laptop? Have you got Wi-Fi? Do you have enough data on your Wi-Fi plan?
Oh yes, the telehealth is a separate form. So I do cover, I do have a separate intake form for telehealth, which covers all of that too.
Yeah.
But I think so I try and I'll say maybe where did you hear about the service? Those types of questions. It tells me the research that they've done, but I try and keep the information quite brief, but also giving them the option to provide more information if they want to. Because for some people, they might say, look, it's really important that you know about this. And actually what I really need in therapy is this. And for other people, they'll say, no, there are no needs. And then I will check that out in the first session.
Yeah.
It's not a detailed tell me everything about your history form for me, because that's the information that I want to get at the initial session.
Okay. What about screening scales? Do you send screeners to people like DASs or BDIs, BAIs?
I have a DAS that's built into it's called Xander now, it used to be called Power Diary. And so there's a DAS built into the forms there, so I can send that out electronically and they can complete that online. I don't think I would go any further than that, because some of the screeners, like for example, I work in trauma, I don't think I'd want to be sending someone a trauma screener, or I've met them. Whereas a DAS is quite a general questionnaire that I'm quite comfortable with them filling out themselves, but I wouldn't go any further.
That's good advice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So these are some of the essentials of that initial contact, and the intake process, and even discussing intake forms that can be used. We've covered off the reasons why this is so important, and we have included some information on how it can be done across different settings. And I think we understand that it is always going to be slightly different. But yeah, these are some of the important ingredients to this process that Claire and I want to share with everyone, so that if you are training and you're going into placements, or if you find yourself a position early on in your career, you can have at least a bit of a guide for what you should be expecting to be set up for you in a position of employment. And certainly if you are a person who's looking to go out into private practice independently, there are lots of great resources you can go to. Yes, there's some resources for people setting up their own sort of clinic and things like that. Definitely get some more information to support you with all of that. But these are some foundations that we would encourage everyone to consider using. Yeah. So one final thing that Claire and I will add is sometimes we can get a little bit confused with the terms initial assessment and intake assessment. So when we are referring to an intake assessment, it is that very first contact, and it can be a brief form, or it can be also a phone call. And you may fill in the form while you're on the phone to someone, and that's your initial intake form, or you might send it like Claire's example that she shared with everyone. But when we generally refer to an initial assessment, that's something that we're doing in the first session with someone.
Yes, and I think some services maybe might call the first session an initial intake, and that may be also because not very much information might be available before that first session, and so the intake and the assessments become quite merged. And so I guess what we're talking about here is the contact, as Isabelle said, outside of the session, before the first session, and so that it's prior to that assessment process, just as an initial sort of screening to assess suitability. Because if a client rings up, particularly like in private practice, and says, do you bulk bill, which I don't, and I tend to think, look, this person's going to probably need a service that's going to be providing them ongoing support. And usually, because of the context of the referrals that I seem to get, people do often need ongoing support. So that's another thing that I'll cover too, is that sometimes, like Medicare, we get a 10-session limit for a rebate every year. But beyond those 10 sessions, there is no rebate. And so I do like to have a little conversation around that too, so that I know, okay, this person really is working within that 10-session framework, and I need to stick to that, versus somebody who's looking for a much longer term therapy and has the means to cover that. Because there are other services that can meet the needs of these people, and it's making sure that I don't want to put them into any kind of financial stress.
Starting them off on a journey with you that you can't finish with them.
Absolutely. So it may sometimes be, okay, this person is needing a completely different service. Or I had a referral the other day for something that was way out of my area of scope and training. And I said, I just think you'll be better off with somebody who has trained specifically in this area, because they're going to know exactly what you're talking about here. I would have had to probably do a lot of research and background research, and get some probably additional training to properly support this person. And they need somebody that can just hit the ground running.
That's great.
Yeah, I think it's so important that we do this before the client is sitting in front of us.
Thank you, Claire. Yes. So we've covered off quite a few key areas for this initial intake process. And we've discussed how important the intake is for setting up for a positive experience for our clients, and also like meeting our ethical obligations, which is including getting informed consent and appropriately managing risk, and really just wanting to establish whether or not our service is the right fit for our clients. Thank you, Claire, for taking some time to talk about this very important topic today.
Thank you. We'll see you later. See you next time.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps others find the show. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Between Two Psychs for more updates and resources. For more information and to explore everything we offer, head over to our website, betweentwopsychs.com.au. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.